Okay, so this one is it's a wild one.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, it's one of those stories where you hear it and you're like, wait a minute, did I hear that right?
Yeah.
It's about this guy, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and the truly unbelievable situation he's found himself in.
Right.
Basically, imagine you're told by the government, hey, we messed up big time. Like, we broke the rules, but fixing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's impossible, apparently.
Yeah. A bit of a head scratcher for sure.
You shared this with us, and honestly, it raises some really big questions about, like, government power and individual rights. The whole thing just seems completely upside down.
Absolutely.
So, to set the scene a little bit, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he fled El Salvador back in 2011 because of the crazy gang violence there, trying to find some safety.
Right. Seeking asylum, basically.
Exactly. And then in 2019, a U.S. immigration judge ruled that he couldn't be deported back to El Salvador.
Huge decision, right?
You would think so, right? You'd think that'd be like, okay, that's settled. He's safe.
A legal protection in place.
Exactly. But that's where things get really, really strange. Because despite that court order, the Trump administration deported him in March.
Just like that.
Yeah, just like that. And their explanation, administrative error.
Administrative error.
I mean, come on, administrative error. It sounds so, bureaucratic and insignificant when we're talking about something that completely upends someone's life.
It really minimizes the impact, doesn't it?
Totally. So I guess my first question is, like, what's your initial reaction to that kind of explanation in this context?
Well, I mean, it feels like a pretty stark contrast to the weight of a judicial ruling, right? We're talking about a judge making a decision based on the law and evidence, and then poof, it's gone because of an error.
Right.
And it immediately brings up this whole idea of the separation of powers,
Yeah.
that thing we maybe vaguely remember from civics class,
Right.
which basically means that government power is divided between different branches, the judicial, the executive, the legislative, to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful.
Checks and balances, right.
Exactly. So when a court, which is part of the judicial branch, issues an order,
Right.
that's a direct exercise of its power.
Right.
And then the executive branch, which is responsible for enforcing the laws, seems to just disregard it, even if it was an accident. It raises some serious red flags.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a pretty major challenge to that whole balance of power thing.
Right.
But it doesn't end there, right? This story gets even more messed up.
Oh, it definitely gets more complicated.
So, okay, the government finally admits, okay, fine, we made a mistake. This administrative error, air quotes, led to us totally violating a court order.
Which they're supposed to uphold.
Exactly. So a judge says, all right, government, you need to fix this. Get Mr. Garcia back to the U.S. Seems logical, right?
Seems like the obvious next step.
You mess up, you clean it up. But here's where the government's response takes a truly bizarre turn. The Department of Justice under the Trump administration at the time they filed this legal brief, basically arguing that the judge's order to bring Mr. Garcia back was indefensible. And get this, they claimed that the U.S. has no authority to make a sovereign nation, meaning El Salvador, release him.
So essentially they're saying, yeah, we screwed up, we admit it, but he's in another country now and there's nothing we can do.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it?
It's a very interesting legal argument, to say the least.
So let me just make sure I understand this correctly. The U.S. government is saying we wrongly deported someone, we broke a court order to do it, and now we can't fix it because it's out of our hands.
That seems to be the gist of their argument, yes.
Okay, so let's unpack this sovereign nation argument. On the surface, it sounds kind of reasonable, right? You can't just go around demanding that other countries hand people over.
Right. Every country has its own laws and jurisdiction.
But doesn't the fact that the U.S. government admitted they made the mistake change things?
That's the key question here, I think. The admission of wrongdoing by the U.S. government arguably creates a moral, if not a legal obligation to try and fix the situation.
Right. It's not just that he ended up in another country by chance. It's that they put him there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while the principle of national sovereignty is important, it often needs to be balanced against other considerations.
Like what?
Like human rights, for example, or a state's responsibility for its own actions.
Okay, so we have this idea of national sovereignty, which is important, but it's not like a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Precisely. There are international norms and treaties that countries agree to that often involve cooperation and obligations between them.
So you're saying there's precedent for nations working together to fix these kinds of situations, even when they involve another country's territory?
Exactly.
And here's another thing that makes this whole situation even more confusing. The source we looked at mentions that the U.S. government is paying El Salvador $6 million for the detention of deportees.
Oh, wow.
So on the one hand, they're saying we have no power to ask for Mr. Garcia back, but on the other hand, they're financially involved in the system that's keeping him there.
That does seem a bit contradictory, doesn't it?
It's more than a bit contradictory. It makes you wonder about the true nature of that relationship between the U.S. and El Salvador and whether that money could be used as leverage to help Mr. Garcia.
It definitely raises questions about the extent of the U.S. government's influence in this situation.
And you know the person in that YouTube video we watched about this, they called the whole thing Banana Republic bullshit.
Yeah.
Now, we're not going to endorse that language necessarily, but I can understand the sentiment. It's just so illogical. A court says no deportation, the government does it anyway, admits it was wrong, and then says it can't be fixed.
It really undermines your faith in the system, doesn't it?
It totally does. And it
Right.
makes you question those basic ideas of fairness and accountability that we're supposed to believe in.
Absolutely. And when you connect this to the bigger picture, it has implications for the rule of law itself.
Okay, break that down for me. What do you mean by that?
Well, if government actions can ignore court orders, and then they can claim they're powerless to correct those mistakes, what does that say about the limits on government power? And what about the protection of individual rights?
Right. It's like, what's the point of having laws and courts if they can be so easily disregarded?
Exactly.
So, out of all of this, what do you think is the most significant implication beyond just Mr. Garcia's situation?
For me, it's the precedent that this could set. If a government can argue that its own admitted error can't be fixed because of another country's sovereignty, it creates this really dangerous loophole.
Like a way to avoid responsibility.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
It could mean that once a wrongful deportation happens, the U.S. government is off the hook, regardless of how badly it messes up someone's life.
Okay, so let's bring this back to our listeners. Why should they care about the specifics of Mr. Garcia's case?
Because it's not just about one man. It's about the fundamental ideas of justice and accountability that our entire system is built on.
Right. It goes way beyond this one situation.
If the government, with all its power and resources, can make this kind of mistake and then say it can't be fixed, it erodes our trust in the system.
It makes you wonder who the system is really working for.
Exactly. And it forces us to think critically about the safeguards that are in place to protect individuals when they're up against the power of the state.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap to make sure we're all on the same page. We have Mr. Garcia, who was deported despite a court order specifically saying he couldn't be. The government admits it messed up. A judge orders his return, and the government's response is basically, tough luck.
Indefensible and impossible to fix.
Right, because El Salvador is a sovereign nation and they can't force them to do anything. And all of this is happening while the U.S. government is giving El Salvador millions of dollars related to the detention of deportees.
The irony is pretty thick, isn't it?
It's incredibly thick. So yeah, we might not be using the same colorful language as that YouTube creator, but it's hard to ignore the sheer absurdity of this whole situation.
It really does make you question the logic behind it all.
So for everyone listening to this, what should they take away from all of this? What's the big question they should be asking themselves?
I think the question is this: what does it mean if a government can admit to a mistake with such huge consequences, but then claim it's powerless to fix it? Where does that leave us?
It's a really unsettling question to think about. And it gets to the heart of what we've been talking about this whole time: government accountability, the limits of power, and the protection of individual rights.
And the balance between national sovereignty and a state's responsibility for its own actions.
Exactly. So here's a final thought to leave you with. Given that the U.S. government has said, yeah, we messed up, and they're even paying for Mr. Garcia's detention in El Salvador, what are some ways he could actually be brought back? And what does this whole case tell us about how governments should act and what they're responsible for in a world that's becoming more and more interconnected every day?
It's a complicated situation with no easy answers.
It definitely is. But it's a situation that deserves our attention because it could have far-reaching consequences for all of us. So keep thinking about it, keep asking questions, and let's try to make sure something like this never happens again.
I agree.
All right, that's it for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.